Her life was one of early losses, doomed romances, and personal betrayals. Mary Stuart is arguably the most famous Scottish monarch who ever lived, and she has captured the Scottish imagination more completely than perhaps any Scot before or since. Today we'll be talking about the life and legacy of Mary Queen of Scots. I hope you enjoy. Mary was born on the 8th of December 1542 at Linlithgow Palace outside Edinburgh in Scotland. And of course it was a very different Scotland back then. The population is estimated to have been roughly 1 million, and more than half of these lived rurally. In comparison, today the Scottish population is slightly shy of 5.5 million, and more than 80% of us live in cities, so quite a change. Politically, there were a few factions involved in the governing of Scotland, but the main ones were, of course, the royal family, the nobles and the kirk. Kirk being the old Scots word for church, and specifically here meaning the Scottish Church, which, as we'll see, underwent significant changes in Mary's lifetime. Her parents were Mary of Guise, or Marie de Guise, who was a French woman, a French noblewoman, and King James V of Scotland. And King James actually died just 6 days after the birth of his daughter, this being the first of quite a few early losses for Mary. And at the time of Mary's birth, Henry VIII was still King of England, and Henry wanted Mary to marry his son Edward, who was a child of 6 at the time. Henry wanted to unite the Scots and the English with a marriage, and in fact there was an agreement to this effect, but the Scots actually reneged on their promise, and if you know anything at all about Henry VIII, you'll know that breaking a promise to him was not exactly a smart move. And in retaliation, English forces were sent to invade and sack much of southern Scotland in 1544. This war would be known as the Rough Wooing, and no, I didn't make that up. That's actually what it's called. Even after Henry's death, Edward Seymour, the English Lord Protector, continued the war for Mary's hand, and unsurprisingly, what with all this rough wooing, it was decided that Scotland was not the safest place for the young Mary, so she was sent off to the French court at age 5. At the court of King Henry II, who was the French king at the time, Mary was well educated in Latin, Greek, Italian, Spanish, and French would essentially become her first language. She had been betrothed to the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne, a lad called Francois. It was actually this very betrothal that had led to the rough wooing back in Scotland. Having been betrothed as children, Mary and Francois were finally married in April 1558, Mary being 16 at the time and her husband just 15. Also in 1558, Elizabeth I acceded to the English throne upon the death of her half-sister, yet another Mary. Now, it should be noted that our Mary, Mary Queen of Scots, Mary that is, also had Tudor blood. She was directly descended from Henry VII, and as many considered Elizabeth to have been the result of an invalid marriage, that of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, Mary was considered by some to have a better claim to the English throne than Elizabeth. The fact that Mary was, and remained her entire life in fact, a staunch Catholic was another point in her favour for some. Bear in mind that England's split from Rome was well within living memory at this point, and still very much a sore point with many. In fact, Mary's father-in-law, Henri II of France, actually claimed the English throne on Mary's behalf, and you can imagine just how well this went down with Elizabeth. Not terribly well, being the answer. So Mary became Queen Consort of France in 1559 at the death of King Henri, when her husband Francois succeeded him to the French throne. But it wouldn't be for long, as she was widowed the very next year. And sadly later that same year, Mary suffered the loss of her mother, Marie de Guise, and now, having lost its regent, Scotland was in want of a queen. Mary returned to Scotland in August 1561, and it was a very different Scotland to the one she had left 13 years ago. The English Reformation had steadily migrated north, and thanks to a number of factors, the perceived corruption of many figures within the kirk, the martyrdom of George Wishart, and the excoriating sermons of the likes of John Knox, Scotland was now a Protestant country, though it did still retain a fairly sizable Catholic constituency. Trying to balance the two groups was a difficult task for the young queen, compounded by the fact that the Scottish nobility were quite a quarrelsome lot at the best of times, religious divide or no. But she was helped in the role in the early years by her illegitimate half-brother, James Stuart, the Earl of Murray. Mary's policy at the outset was one of religious tolerance, despite pressure from the Pope, the Spanish and the French for her to attempt to restore Catholicism to Scotland. In fact, you could even argue that she overcorrected. She furnished her Privy Council with 3 times as many Protestants as Catholics, and as you can imagine, this angered many Scottish Catholics who saw Mary's actions as a betrayal of their faith. Notably, Lord Huntly, who was one of the few Catholics on Mary's Privy Council, raised a short-lived rebellion against her in the Highlands. Choosing a consort would also be difficult for Mary due to all the factions she needed to placate. If she were to marry a Catholic, the Protestant faction would be alienated, and likewise, if she married a Protestant, that would anger the Catholic contingent as well as earning her the displeasure of the Holy See. What's more, Queen Elizabeth had also taken a personal interest in Mary's choice of husband, meaning Mary had to worry about potentially damaging her relationship with Elizabeth to boot. A number of suitors were considered, the Spanish nobleman Don Carlo, the English lords Darnley and Dudley being the most notable, and unsurprisingly none of these men was the ideal candidate, if such a thing could have existed given poor Mary's predicament. But in the end, Mary married the Catholic Lord Darnley in a Protestant ceremony on the 29th of July 1565. Darnley was an English subject, though with considerable Scottish lineage. Nonetheless, Elizabeth was not pleased. You see, far from marrying Lord Dudley, who had been Elizabeth's choice for Mary, instead Mary chose to marry one of Elizabeth's own subjects against her wishes. Even worse, Darnley was also descended from Henry VII, Henry Tudor. Could this mean Mary had ambitions in the direction of the English throne? Elizabeth asked herself. And it wasn't just the English queen who was angered by the match. James Stuart, the Earl of Murray, whom you'll remember was Mary's closest advisor and who detested Darnley, led a group of Protestant lords in rebellion against Mary and her new husband. The rebellion known as the Chaseabout Raid, and again, no, I'm not making these up, that's actually what that one's called too. Well, silly name or not, due to lack of popular support and the fact that the aid the rebels had expected from Elizabeth never materialised, the rebellion was short-lived and fizzled out rather quickly. Anyway, back to Mary. You might be wondering why she chose to marry such a contentious man, and the answer appears to be that she fell passionately in love with Darnley, or at any rate that's what many believed at the time. However, it was a disastrous marriage. Not only was Darnley a divisive man politically, but personally he soon proved himself to be grasping, arrogant and treacherous. Only a few short months into the marriage, and when Mary had fallen pregnant, Darnley grew increasingly suspicious of the relationship between Mary and her private secretary, a man called David Riccio, or sometimes Rizzio. Perhaps he'd heard speculation about the paternity of the child Mary was carrying, or perhaps he was suspicious of the amount of time she was spending with another man. Either way, his jealousy was certainly piqued. Also, Mary had, rather wisely, refused to grant him the crown matrimonial, which is a right that would have elevated Darnley to joint ruler with Mary, and given him the ability to rule in his own right, should Mary have predeceased him. Both this and the Riccio situation had caused Darnley to really rather resent his wife. So much so that in March 1566, Darnley and a group of noblemen made their way to Holyrood Palace and murdered Riccio in the Queen's private supper chamber. Allegedly, they stabbed him 57 times right in front of the pregnant Mary. We can only imagine how shaken Mary would have been by this betrayal, and let's not forget that not only was her husband present, but also some of the most notable lords in the land. And so Mary began to wonder if it had not been she who had been the intended victim of the plot. By the time of the birth of their son James on the 19th of June 1566, the marriage between Mary and Darnley had broken down completely. The question of what should be done with the increasingly deranged Darnley vexed Mary and her advisers for some time. However, what would follow is to this day one of the most hotly debated episodes in Scottish history. On the 9th of February 1567, Darnley was caught up in an explosion, the cause of which isn't known to this day. More mysteriously, Darnley's body was discovered away from the wreckage of the building in a neighbouring garden, and he'd been strangled. Who killed Lord Darnley? Scotland's biggest murder mystery was greeted with frenzied speculation both at home and abroad. The most enduring hypotheses are firstly that Darnley accidentally caused the explosion himself in a botched attempt to assassinate his wife, who wasn't even in the building at the time, having gone to the wedding of a friend earlier that evening. Secondly, that Mary and her new lover, James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, had got Darnley out of the way so that the pair could marry. And thirdly, that the nobles who opposed Darnley had thought that the easiest way of getting him out of the way was to have him killed. And this last one does seem to be the most popular among historians, certainly from what I've read. But I suppose the most important question for us is, did Mary know about the plot? Was Mary involved in the murder of her husband? And I suppose we'll never get a definitive answer for that one. One name that came up over and over again in connection with the murder of Darnley was that of Bothwell, Mary's supposed lover. You see, shortly after the birth of her son, Mary had made several trips to visit Bothwell after he'd been wounded, and it certainly seems to have been widely believed at the time that Bothwell was behind the plot to kill Darnley. So you can only imagine the scandal when 3 months later it was announced that Mary had taken him as her new husband. Though it's been suggested that he abducted her and forced the marriage, it was nonetheless a bridge too far for the Scottish lords. They raised an army and met Mary and Bothwell at Carberry Hill, which is outside Edinburgh, and poor Mary was marched through the streets of the city before being taken to Lochleven Castle, where she was imprisoned. In July 1567, she was forced to give up the Scottish throne to her 13-month-old son James, and our friend the Earl of Murray, who had advised Mary at the beginning of her reign, was appointed regent to the young king. The following May, Mary actually managed to escape from Lochleven Castle, but the defeat of her supporters at Langside by Murray meant that she had no choice but to flee Scotland and seek refuge in England. Mary tried to seek Elizabeth's help and protection, but the English Queen kept her at arm's length. She did, however, refuse to condemn Mary when Murray produced the so-called casket letters, which, according to him, were proof that Mary had been involved in the death of Lord Darnley. And so, for the next 18 years of her life, Mary was held captive in various English castles. Whilst it's true that she was denied her freedom, she was, nonetheless, at least initially, kept very comfortable by her captors. She had her own chef as well as a staff of at least 16 waiting on her. Her rooms were quite lavishly decorated, and she was even allowed to keep small dogs and birds, though presumably not together. Still, Mary entreated Elizabeth to release her many times, but to no avail. The problem was that Mary was often the subject of plots for Catholic restoration by Catholics both in England and even abroad. As a result of this, Mary's captivity became stricter, and it's unclear to what degree, if any, Mary was involved in these plots. A series of letters decoded just a couple of years ago suggest that she was involved in at least one of the plots. But the increasingly bleak conditions of her incarceration were beginning to take their toll on the Queen. She had developed arthritis and her health was generally on the decline. Her son, who was now King of Scotland in his own right, King James, publicly sided with Elizabeth in rejecting Mary's proposal that she publicly renounce her claim to the English throne in exchange for her freedom from jail. Yet another blow for Mary. Though to be a bit kinder to James, he hadn't seen his mother since he was less than a year old, so his lack of loyalty is somewhat to be expected. And after nearly 2 decades of turmoil, Elizabeth finally decided that having her cousin alive was just too dangerous, and that the Mary question would have to be settled once and for all. It came about in the following way. In 1586, a letter written by Mary was intercepted and decoded on the orders of Sir Francis Walsingham, who was Elizabeth's spymaster. The letter's contents showed that Mary agreed to the assassination of her cousin so that she could take Elizabeth's English throne and return the nation to the Pope. While Mary vehemently denied her involvement in the Babington plot, as this conspiracy is known, Elizabeth wasted no time in having Mary seized and put on trial for treason. Mary was duly condemned by an English court to death by beheading. And so, at the age of 44, after having spent nearly half her life in captivity, Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded on the 8th of February 1587 at Fotheringay Castle. A staunch Catholic to the end, it was remarked upon at the time with what bravery she met her fate. Her final words were, "In manus tuus Domini commendo spiritum meum," which translates from the Latin as, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." Mary's body now rests at the Henry VII Chapel at Westminster Abbey. Hi everyone, I hope you enjoyed that little insight into the life of Mary Queen of Scots. Now, I wanted to do my first YouTube video on Mary just because she's always been this sort of larger-than-life character, especially in Scotland. There's a sort of, I don't know what you'd say, mythos surrounding her. I can remember when me, my brother and sister were very, very young kids, my granny used to tell us stories about how at the beheading Mary had hidden one of her dogs in her dress, so when she was beheaded the fabric appeared to be moving and gave everyone a fright, thinking that she was still alive. Don't know if it's true or not, but it's definitely a good story. And the fact that so much of her life is still a mystery. We don't know if she was involved in the plot to kill Darnley. We don't know to what extent she was plotting to kill Elizabeth. But she's just this fascinating figure who really does just jump out of the page at you. I suppose that's why we love history, really, don't we? We see these people as more than just names and dates, and we love reading about their lives. But that's going to do it for this video, and I really do hope you enjoyed it. As I say, it is my first one, so hopefully everything will improve as we go along. Please subscribe if you'd like, and if you enjoyed the video, I believe it's good to give it a thumbs up. I don't know what it does, but everyone says it, so I shall too. And stay tuned for next time, and all the very best. Bye bye.